A great pleasure to have a chance to talk to Richard Rathbone. Richard, when and where were you born?
I was born December the 18th, 1942, week before Christmas, and was born in London, just outside London, in Richmond in Surrey. But it actually is London, the sprawl of London.
Yeah. Tell me, some people go back to the Norman Conquest, but you don't need to do that. Just tell me something about back to your grandparents or whenever you'd like to go.
I know next to nothing about my father's parents. I know nothing about my father's family because of my mother's subsequent marriage, which rather shut down my father's side. I was kept away from my father's kin. And I know next to nothing, I'm afraid, about my mother's side either, except that they were Londoners, and that's about it. I knew my maternal grandparents quite well, a rather larger-than-life grandmother and a rather smaller-than-life grandfather, who she dominated and bullied, a conspiracy of women against this poor little man. But I know next to nothing about the family at all.
Mm. Well, this is a surrogate question for social class, of course. So how would you sort of characterise what you do know about your ancestors? Would you say they were North London shopkeepers or earls or...
Sub-shopkeepers, I think. Not exactly menu peuple, but certainly lower middle class.
Mm. But you said you knew something about your maternal grandparents.
Well, only that I knew them.
Mm.
I knew them.
You actually knew them physically?
Yes, my grandfather died when I was about 6 or 7, and my grandmother died when I was about 9.
Mm.
And because my mother for some period was a single mother, I got to know my grandmother particularly well.
Mm. Well, you didn't know your father at all, really, did you?
My father was killed in the war. He was a pilot,
That's
and I think I was about 8 months old when he was killed. And the proximate memory really of him was little bits of memorabilia around, RAF badges, all of which gradually disappeared when my mother remarried.
Mm. Do you have brothers or sisters?
None at all.
Mm. Well, your mother, therefore, was a very central person probably in your life. Is she still alive?
No, she died about 20 years ago.
Mm. Tell me something about how her character and your stepfather might have formed your character at all.
It's very difficult to judge that, but my father, my real father, and my mother were rather beautiful people. There's some photographs of them being young and glamorous. They both worked for the BBC. He worked for The Listener, and she was a multilingual personal assistant at somebody. And they had lots of glamorous friends in the BBC. And they lived on a houseboat in Teddington. So it was all rather raffish and rather bohemian and rather splendid. And then, of course, he was killed. And she was
in the Air Force, wasn't he?
He was in the Air Force. And he was killed flying. I mean, so there was a sort of romance for a schoolboy to latch on to. But she went into a flat spin, which is an appropriate metaphor for a widow pilot, and never really went back to work after he died, and remained, to a certain extent, I think it's not entirely unfair to say, a pretty little woman. So far as her post-widowhood love life is concerned, I know very little, other than that she had obviously a rather powerful romance with somebody from an American Air Force officer. But he went back to Richmond, Virginia, to my, I suppose, relief. Otherwise, I would have been brought up in Richmond, Virginia. And then she remarried, clearly not out of love, but for money and security, which is blameless in a sense. She wanted a secure life for her boy.
Not anything of what you say will hurt any of her relatives, or...
No, I think not.
Okay.
But she married a rich man much older than her, who was very unused to having a child in the house. And
how old were you when this happened?
I was about 8 or 9. I can't remember accurately when that was so. But I was already at prep school by then. And he transformed my life in a very sort of Hamletian way, I suppose, except I don't think I ever felt quite that way about it. But he was a bully, and a hater of the kind of noise that children make, and a hater of the kind of things that children are, which is messy and so on. And I lived in terror of him pretty much until his death.
Which was when?
He died shortly after I got married in the mid-1960s, 1965, I think.
It's a long time ago.
Long time.
He won't be watching this.
Well, who knows?
Who knows? But clearly your parents, anyway, were from a kind of literary and white-collar background in the BBC and so on. Was your mother interested in ideas and encouraging you in education and university and things like this?
Not at all. She had no experience of this. She wasn't a graduate. My knowledge of my father's literary interests were entirely a store of books that I had of his, which were quite recherché for when I was a child to look at. Maeterlinck and so on. Serious reading. A lot of it in translation, but quite a lot of it in French too. Most of which disappeared under my stepfather's aegis because he was a very jealous man and didn't like memorabilia around the place. And a handful of dedications in books from people who were clearly friends of his. And including a sort of straggle of things like New Left Book Club editions and so on. So he was certainly there, but my mother never was. I think she was always glamorous and not much else. And that was true pretty much of her through my knowledge of her that bit of her life. She liked music quite a lot, and she was quite a decent pianist. But that was the limit. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just what she was.
What was your earliest memory? I mean, definite memory, not just sort of leaves waving above your pram.
It's pretty much a leaves waving above the pram. I remember being wheeled into an airing cupboard during an air raid at a very, very young age, and have attributed ever since my dislike of cramped, confined spaces like aeroplanes and tube trains and Eurostar to that. But my biggest memory, powerful emotional memory, was it must have been either VE or VJ Day, the day of the celebration of the end of the Second World War. My mother kneeling in the hall of the flat we lived in, and her eyes pouring with tears, embracing me, telling me that my father wasn't going to come home, which was a pretty powerful memory, actually, quite a strong memory.
You presumably knew that already.
I'm not sure whether I did or not, but it was quite a wrenchy memory.
Indeed. When you were sort of before prep school, that period, kindergarten-ish period, do you remember anything outstanding in the way of particularly hobbies or interests or wandering around doing anything before you went to prep school?
I went to a funny little Montessori school, which in a sense was the making of me, but also the destruction of me, in that they were very permissive about my not liking maths, which dogged me because I actually wanted to be a scientist, I think, at one stage of my life, but just was so behind in this. But I read a lot, and I read very early, and I think that's probably quite common amongst the only children, but I did read very young, and was always at pre-prep school sitting in a corner reading.
What were you reading?
Anything and everything. And but from a very early stage, and I can remember this, reading things like Puck of Pook's Hill when I was very young, and liking always historical fiction from childhood. And I also remember drawing historical things like knights in armour from a very young age. I was always tickled by history. But of course everything else was neglected, which was not a good thing.
So you went on to preparatory school. Where did you go? And was it boarding or?
I went to my father's old school because there was because my mother was not yet remarried and was not penniless, but was living on an RAF widow's pension. So I went to Collet Court, the St Paul's School Junior School, St Paul's School
St Paul's,
Junior School, which was then in Hammersmith, and stayed there until I went to St Paul's Senior School. So that was school.
Do you remember anything about the prep school?
Well, the chief memory about prep school, of course, was my mother's remarriage in that period. And in a way, I guess the world coming to an end in some respects, in that life began to be sad and a bit threatening. I was a day boy, and began a rather disastrous course in many senses of a sort of escape and evasion exercise, which was courting the friendship of other boys by being funny. By being funny, yes. But also another propensity, which was the relationship I now see between need and greed. As I became a very fat little boy, in that I ate because I guess I didn't get enough cuddling, to put it crudely. So I was a funny, I think much liked, because he was funny, fat boy.
What was your nickname? Do you remember?
No, I didn't have a denigratory nickname. But I also began to try and court affection and support at home by illness. And it's a trick I learnt from my stepfather, who was a great manipulator a great blackmailer, using illness as a way of securing attention. And I did the same. And I have a pretty strong memory of feigning illnesses in order to be looked after and for people to be nice to me. So those are the primary memories of prep school. I remember next to nothing about prep school in terms of the intellect, other than quite enjoying music lessons, except that I never learnt to read music. We had an hour a week of music, but I never learnt an instrument. And enjoying always the English side of the humanities side of education, and being always left behind in maths and science, always. Never ever caught up with that ever, which was a tragedy in some senses.
Then you went on to St. Paul's, about which you've probably got stronger memories.
Yes.
One of the things that's often very revealing is one or two teachers who stand out. They're sometimes at prep school, but certainly at public school. Were there any that really influenced your life?
Very powerfully. I mean, it was a strange life, because I moved up to big school with the same self-imposed disabilities that I'd cultivated at prep school. And I was in the lowest classes for the first two and a half years of my career at St. Paul's. I was an under-functioning, I suppose, little boy. And the big change occurred in, I suppose it was my O-level year. I don't know what the equivalent today is, but the first big public exam, when I spied on the Sir Master's desk, which I had to go in to see him. There's a list
What
of...
is Sir Master?
Sir Master was the deputy headmaster.
Right.
St. Paul's had a high master rather than a headmaster. And on the Sir Master, a very nice man called Alan Cook, who I liked, on his desk was a list of about 6 or 7 names of boys who were not going to get O-levels. And my name was on it. And it was the first sort of slapping I'd got in a big way, of a recognition that not only was I bumping along the bottom, but that actually was probably going to fall through the hatch. And I think already begun to realise that I wasn't very happy, and that trying to make people who played rugby amused and trying to follow the fast set at school really wasn't satisfying me at all. And I was helped in that by two teachers. One was a rather remarkable teacher called John Osborne, who introduced me to Coleridge, and just was a tale spinner, and recognised that I liked poetry and that I liked novels, and gave me books to read. And another was my housemaster, was a man called Rathbone, who...
How do you spell that?
Retallack, I think it's a Cornish name, who rather oddly, when I was 15, I think, gave me a copy of Dubliners and said, "You'll like this." And hell, I did like it. And then started giving me volumes of poetry. And both of them had seen something in me that was at least rescuable, I guess. But the big influence on my life was the big influence, I think, on anybody who'd been to St. Paul's who read history. And that was a remarkable man called Philip Whitting, who was my history teacher, who was eccentric and often mad, but quite extraordinarily charismatic history teacher, and a very brilliant history teacher.
Was that Whitting?
Whitting, Whitting. And the joy of Philip Whitting was that he was a numismatist, but not a normal coin collector. He collected Ottoman coins, and consequently knew a lot about the Ottoman Empire, and was the first time I'd ever come into contact with a historian who didn't work on Tudors and Stuarts. And that was tremendous, because they had wonderful names, and they had lovely things in their hands, and jewels and scimitars and so on. And I think it was partly through him that I came to start reading slightly odd things. In my immediate O-level I survived, and got into what was called the History 8 school. And at that stage started reading peculiar things like Jessie Weston and The Golden Bough, and being rather excited by otherness, I suppose we would call it today. As a historian, this wasn't, of course, reflected in the syllabus. I did Henry II like everybody else. But I began to be excited by history, but it was in a way too late. It should have happened earlier.
Was he a sixth form? I mean,
he was, it's the eighth form at St Paul's, but yes, the sixth form. And I was also taught by a rather remarkable man who went on to be, worked for the BBC, went on to be an editor for Penguin, and ended up as Professor of International History at Sussex, a man called Christopher Thorne, who died very young, who was another major influence on my life, and was another person who believed in me, which I suppose is what I'm talking about, and an encouragement.
Was the teaching, as it was at Sedbergh in your last couple of years, kind of preparation for university, in the sense that it was much more privatised and more write an essay on something and come and we'll talk about it in a week kind of teaching, or was it still very much form teaching?
There was both. The form teaching was wonderful note-taking. I still have Philip Whitting's notes in notebooks at home, and they're still pretty good. And they really were driven by primary sources, and you were encouraged to go away and read Walter Pater and so on. There was a lot of that push, and I think most of us did who cared about it. But there was also the essay tutorial in a little cupboard under the stairs that he inhabited, rather like a ship's cabin, in which he'd tear you to pieces.
I think Gareth described this.
Yes.
Stedman Jones.
Yes, we're almost
the same place under the stairs.
Yes, we're exact contemporaries, so it would have been very similar. But we only did the A-level year. The final year was only a year. You didn't do it in 2 years. You were expected to live in the library otherwise. And of course, it was because it was an old school, had a very fine library, a very enjoyable library to potter around, which we were allowed and encouraged to do.
What other things were you doing at the school? Were you keen on drama or music or any particular hobbies? Or
I was keen on all of those things, but not as a participant, really. Like Gareth and like other mutual friends of ours, we were members of something called the Gallery Club, which, because we were a London school, meant that we went to plays, and we occasionally read plays as a group of people. We had dinners, and sometimes these were rather glamorous. We had, I remember, a wonderful dinner for Isaiah Berlin, which was very inspiring and exciting to be sitting with somebody who was then a great man, and Victor Gollancz, who was an old boy of the school, who was rather splendid, and that sort of thing. So plays and performance and so on. And it was a very exciting time because it was the beginning of kitchen sink drama and so on. The whole world was turning upside down.
This is the mid-50s?
The mid to late 50s, yes.
Yeah, it's John Arden. And,
very much so, yes.
And Room at the Top and all this sort of stuff. Yeah. Very exciting time, and just the early rock period.
Yeah.
Were you into rock around the clock and the new beginnings of Elvis and so on, or not?
Yes, I think I did like it, but I think I was much too shy and nervous ever to sort of partake. I didn't cut a rug, I think, the expression very often. I was a shy and my presentation of self in everyday life was a jolly chap. But the real person, I think, the person I really was much more reticent and nervous about the opinions of others. And particularly, I think, a problem that I would psychoanalyze in a way from childhood, an apprehension about the opinions and views of older males who were allocators of authority and value in my life, which was a sequence of people, obviously from my stepfather onwards, went on to my supervisor and my first employers, I suppose.
Was your stepfather still being bullying and so on at this stage, or?
Oh, very much so, because of course I was penniless. And in those days, once one went on to university, you were dependent on a parental statement in order to get a grant. I had a state scholarship, which was £50 a year at university, and nothing else. So I had to be good in order to get basically pocket money out of my stepfather. And I found that very hard. I still find it very hard.
Although we're not getting it from him. One of the things that happens at about 15 often, and certainly at St Paul's, although St Paul's had a Jewish element in it, I gather, but the Christians among them often go into confirmation. Were you confirmed?
No.
No, but did you go through, often this is the period when you go through a kind of religious phase, 16, 17, either questioning or affirming some religious trend. Did this happen to you?
I'm afraid it didn't happen to me. It should have done, and I feel rather left out. It didn't.
But what, this is a roundabout way of asking about what role religion played either then or later in your life.
I've always been fascinated by religion, but never caught up in it, if you see what I mean. I'm a choral singer in retirement, and enjoy particularly Baroque music and particularly, obviously, sacred Baroque music. A very large chunk of Baroque music is sacred. I enjoy that enormously, and I can see and can feel the spirituality in it, but it doesn't mean anything in terms of any belief in creation or a hereafter or whatever. I'm afraid I'm the atheist side of agnostic, and I always have been. Although I'm absolutely fascinated by the religions of others. Belief interests me very much.
Well, as a West Africanist, you'd
very much so. Yes.
Have to be interested in those sorts of things. Was your mother or stepfather or any family interested in religion? They didn't.
My mother wasn't. My mother was an agnostic and a poo-pooer. She thought it was all a load of bloody rubbish. And my stepfather was Jewish, and a rather bigoted Jew at that, who was mistrustful of Gentile society. And given, presumably, I can know rather more about his family than I know about my own. Given the proximate cause of their coming to this country, one can readily understand why. But there was a great belief in the propriety of ritual on his part, and that you maintained your dignity by observing things. And because I didn't, I was bad, which I'm not. I concede.
Was your family, I mean, did they follow the rites, some of the Jewish rites? And you had
He did,
yes.
He did. Yeah.
And he pulled you into this? Or?
Yes.
Yeah. What about hobbies at this stage of your life? I mean, things like fishing or walking or collecting birds' eggs or other things. Did you have any hobbies?
Not really. I had a bike, which was very important to me, and that was an escape mechanism. And I did cycle a lot, all over the place, mainly with friends. I fished a bit, but not much. No, I wasn't really a hobby boy at all in that sense. It was always reading, and rather obsessively, I'm afraid. Great library stack stalker.
What were you reading at this stage?
Vast amounts of sort of forgotten literature, lots and lots of 19th century stuff, lots of Thackeray, lots of Dickens, and enjoying it, of course, and taking that all rather seriously, I think. I thought that's what you should do, I suppose, but I enjoyed it.
And you were beginning to do reasonably well, so you started to move towards A-levels, presumably.
Yes, but in a sense too late, because the game plan at St Paul's, if you were in this particular class, was that you spent your last year preparing for sitting a scholarship to either Oxford or Cambridge, And so far as I was concerned, so far as their treatment of me was concerned, the advice was to put that off for a year. So instead of going in for a scholarship exam by my 18th birthday, I was to take up a place at Queen Mary College in London, not least because of the contact between Philip Whitting and the then head of history at Queen Mary College, who was the great Tudor historian Bindolph.
Yeah,
And Bindolph's son was in my class, Tim Bindolph, who I liked very greatly. And the game plan was that I would go to Queen Mary for a year and then sit the appropriate exam. But, as they say, events intervened, and I didn't do that.
So what did you do?
I didn't do that because within weeks of starting at what was then a great intercollegiate history school in the University of London, this peculiar place called the School of Oriental and African Studies had launched a degree in history which had a very large element of African history in it. And I started going to lectures by this strange pioneering historian, a man called Roland Oliver, and his colleagues, a man called John Fage, recently back from being head of history at the University of Ghana in Legon, and others, and got tremendously excited by this because it was a band of history that went from very early man, and this is the era where Olduvai Gorge was being dug, where it was becoming inescapably the case that we are all descended from people from Africa. Oliver actually brought back one of the hominid skulls on a flight from East Africa in a box. It was all very romantic. And he was, I suppose, the first historian that I'd met who had dusty boots in a very real sense. I mean, he knew a lot about early man. He read all the stuff. He wrote a lot about archaeology, but also about historical linguistics, about dendrochronology, but also knew a lot about nationalism. And this great span of history that was breathtaking, literally breathtaking. And it wasn't Tudors and Stuarts. I've got nothing against Tudors and Stuarts, but other people had done that.
Yeah.
And I got drawn in. And then by the end of that first year of getting more and more involved with this, learnt that we might spend the second year in Africa at the University of Ghana, and that was game, set and match. The attraction of Africa was partly because it was new and because other people hadn't done it, if you see what I mean. It felt like other people hadn't done it. But the other attraction was that it actually chimed in with things that I'd liked when I was younger. It did chime in with Fraser, it did chime in with Jessie Weston, it did chime in with fiction like Mary Renault. It was about fire and, god kings and things like that. It was very, very thrilling to be around a world. It was the world of Agamemnon, except it was hotter, and so on. That was very, very exciting. And then, of course, the prospect of going away to where I'd become interested, the place I'd become interested in, was just unstoppable and proved to be a very exciting, formative experience.
You were allowed to just sort of drift from one college to another college?
In terms of lectures, yes.
Well, not just lectures. Did you change your course? I mean, did you move
Pretty
from
much.
St Mary's? Queen Mary's?
Pretty much, yes. My first degree is from Queen Mary College, but I was a sitting tenant at SIS by then.
So you were allowed to go on your year to Africa?
Yes.
Well, that obviously had a huge influence on you.
Yes.
Often anthropologists remember that stepping off the boat in the Trobriand Islands moment. Tell me about your first impressions of Africa.
It was stepping off the boat. It was so much more expensive to fly in those days than to go by boat. We went first class from Liverpool on a rather wonderful boat, which called in. The first smell of Africa was off the Canaries, of course, and it was a smell, that smell of vegetation and humidity. And then the boat stopped at Freetown in Sierra Leone, and then at Monrovia in Liberia, and then at the very newly built deepwater port at Tema, just to the east of Accra. And the first experience was, of course, seeing seeing the bush from the sea in the same way that Joseph Conrad sees the bush from the sea and relates that in Heart of Darkness, and a real experience of it. And it was about smells, and of course it was about the heat and sounds. I always associate the smell of burning charcoal and the sound of chickens with Africa. It always seems to me that what village Africa sounds like to me. And it was very exciting, amazingly exciting. And the whole thing was a challenge, of course, living in an African hall of residence, eating African food, with being one of the very few white people on campus other than faculty. In the countryside, although today Accra and the university are linked by a massive suburb, it was about 14 kilometres from the centre of town, and it was not in the bush exactly, but when you went up to the top of the hill, the top of the campus, you looked around and it was farmland, entirely farmland. Now it's just habitation, which is rather sad. But the world was full of very exciting people when I was there. It was the Institute of African Studies, where I spent more of time than I should have done. I should have been doing more history and less messing about, but it was exciting messing about. It was run by Thomas Hodgkin, who was an exciting, charismatic figure. And round him were clustered a whole bunch of political refugees. Vice-Chancellor was Conor Cruise O'Brien, who gave lectures which shocked me in their candour about how awful the United Nations was. The whole thing was just wonderful. But the real crowning glory was at the end of the year. Also, I know, that's unfair to say that. I was lectured by some extraordinarily good historians there, including the great Jack Lander, for example, which was great fun. But then I took off at the end of May after exams, and hitchhiked home. In those days, I managed to get all of my visas.
On your own?
Yeah, but all my visas in one afternoon in Accra, and it cost about £5 to places which you wouldn't dream of going to now, like Mali, and which was tremendous.
How did you get across the desert, or did you go up the coast?
I went up the desert, and I did that with the assistance of a Russian medical team who were going from Timbuktu into Algeria, and it was all very, very thrilling. But in the course of which, I went to places like Guinea and, as I say, lots of places that you probably wouldn't go to now. And met some extraordinary people. I was imprisoned for a brief while for taking photographs of a football match which happened to be on military land. But I saw, the great mosques in Timbuktu. I saw the great mosque in Jenny, the great fish market at Mopti, and so on. That was exciting stuff, all on about 25 quid.
You keep a diary?
Unfortunately not. And the other horrible thing is I bought a cine camera, and none of the film came out, or almost none of the film came out, which was tragic, but there we are. But I travelled with slaves, literally, and goats, and women who were sold in markets, and it was a very wonderful experience for a 19-year-old. Which has never left me.
Did it increase, you describe yourself as lacking self-confidence and so on, particularly in relation to your stepfather. When you arrived back, did you feel more free and liberated and strong against him and others, or not? Had it changed you?
No, I felt more imprisoned because I'd lived in the open air, which in some ways is something I do like. I had hair once upon a time, and I loved the wind in my hair, and I liked the desert. It was exciting. I liked Tuaregs and all of that sort of thrill, and it was a bit sort of Lawrence of Arabia, and I enjoyed all of that. To suddenly be back in London with no money, dependent upon a rather irascible, rather menacing stepfather, wasn't a great pleasure. But then I met my wife, that's when life changed in a very positive way.
This is about 63, is it?
No, this is, yes, 63 is exactly right. Very accurate.
Well, that's the Beatles.
Yes.
And the end of my undergraduate time. Well, you mentioned your wife, Frances. Tell me something about meeting her if you want to. And
I met her on top of a bus. And she looked like Juliette Greco, who I thought was rather dishy at the time, a great French singer. And I asked her out. She was at Queen Mary College reading English.
Frances.
Yes. with being taught by some rather remarkable people, including Simon Gray, the novelist and playwright. She was a highly imaginative, highly literate person, a Catholic, but not a practicing Catholic, a lapsing Catholic by that stage, and ultimately completely lapsed. But the kind of person that knew lots of poetry and was very civilized. Our first date was a disaster because I had no money, so I asked her out and she paid for it, which I suppose quite romantic. And our second date was even more disastrous. We went to see an Iris Murdoch play, The Bell, I think. Was it The Bell? I can't remember. Anyhow, and as we went down to the tube, I was taking her home. The tube doors shut, and I was on one side of the doors and she was on the other, which has a sort of cinematic quality to it, which was lost on me. But anyhow, we ended up living together and then getting married. And that was, in many senses, where I suppose a competent adulthood began, with the strength of the knowledge of having backup by an intelligent, reliable, honest person, which was pretty much my first real experience of that over time, which thankfully has gone on for nearly 50 years now. So.
Have you had children?
We have 2 children, and we have grandchildren too. Our youngest child is 42, so we have, yes, lots, 2 children and 2 grandchildren. That's enough in terms of the planet.
Given that, yes, for family planning.
Yep.
And Frances worked as a novelist, is she? Or?
She's a novelist. She was a school teacher until we had children, and then she started teaching dyslexic children. She did her PGCE thesis on her dissertation on autism, became very interested in dyslexia and started teaching dyslexics, and then started writing, and has written 27 books, including a biography of Christina Rossetti, the Virago biography, 2 adult novels, very nice volume I like of collective poetry. She's had poetry published and composed to by musicians. Mostly writes for teenagers now, but the house is very full of books, and that is a pleasure for both of us, I think.
I'm not sure we mentioned her second name, Thompson.
Thomas,
Frances Thomas, just to give her a plug. Does she take an interest in your work as well? Does she read anything that you write, or?
She's read, I think, just about everything that I've ever written, and if there's any melody in what I write, then it's down to her. She's been a great grammar coach and a great axer of my excessive adjectives and so on. She's very good at that, but she's not, I think, au fond, really interested in what I do. There are times when it arcs. There have been moments in terms of her literary and other interests where there's been a matching. For example, a wonderful play called A Four-Night Come by a man called Rudkin, which is a straight bit of anthropology about yearkings. I mean, it's a very Yeatsian kind of thing about killing somebody in order to propitiate a harvest. It was a favourite play of ours, but I liked it because I was an Africanist, and she liked it because she'd read The Wasteland and loved it and understood all of that. So there are these bits of real harmony in terms of interest. And I think by and large she's enjoyed reading African writers, but she's only been to Africa with me once, because we had children at home. And she's not uninterested in it, she's just got other things to do. It has her own life.
Okay, well, let's return to Queen Mary's, where you were squatting tenant. You had a last year. Was it?
Yes.
It was 3 years. So you did your finals in history, and got a reasonable degree.
Well, not really a very good degree, and was despairing of what I should do. And Roland Oliver, who was by then professor of African history, I think the first professor of African history in Britain. I'm certain he was the first professor, who by then was the co-author of the Penguin History of Africa, which was the first big history of Africa that had been written of a modern sort. although I have to admit I've never finished it. I find it tedious in the extreme, as has every student I've ever taught found it tedious in the extreme. Said, why don't you do research? And this is what I wanted to do, but unfortunately, still that sort of slightly whipped cur quality that I'd brought with me from young life didn't have the sort of nerve to suggest what I wanted to do or who I intellectually was. And he fobbed off on me a project which was half good, in that a big tranche of private papers had turned up, the papers of the last governor of Ghana, a man called Charles Alden Clark. And in return for writing his biography, a young scholar could work on these. And this was a bit of patronage from Roland Oliver, which got me back to Ghana for, again, a wonderful 8 months of research, interviewing all sorts of veterans of the nationalist struggle and so on. All of that fascinated me and excited me. There were, unfortunately, things that didn't fascinate me, and the notion of writing a biography. And I think I recognised very early on, after the Ph.D., which I got, that the biography was beyond me, that basically I was far too young to write a biography. I don't think biography is something that young people do particularly well. I had no insights into him as a subject. He was just a big authority figure, and a lot of the sort of biographical conclusions I came to about him were simply reductive, childish bits of pseudo-Freudian stuff. And I realised I was going to botch this, and so I didn't do the biography. But in the course of writing that thesis, I suppose I became probably the person who knew more about Ghanaian nationalism and its relationship to the end of the British Empire than anybody alive. And that was useful and always fascinating, and has continued to fascinate me.
Did you keep the notes of the interviews?
I have all my notes still,
good,
yes.
Good. Deposit them carefully.
I should deposit them. They're in ghastly handwriting.
You didn't tape them or anything?
Oh, it's pre-tape.
Heimendorf was out there with his tape recorder, but it was...
but he was an efficient man. I took far too few photographs, and I did far too little technologically to preserve things that, of course, will never happen again. And I feel a great sense of loss about that. Images and places that, and it's John Argyle, the anthropologist, said to me once that somewhere he'd worked on, he went back to, and it was a bus shelter. And I think the devastating quality of that's been part of my life, of going back to Ghana, finding places that I remember as places that I'd been to marriage ceremonies and so on. Now, car parks and supermarkets and things. Very sad in a way.
Did you, by that time, were you beginning to encounter the anthropologists of Ghana?
Yes, not just of Ghana. My career was that after my PhD, or the last year of my PhD, I got a junior research fellowship at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies in London, where I was lucky enough to work with 2 other junior fellows, one of whom was Stanley Trepido, who was probably arguably the greatest 19th century historian of South Africa, a political refugee, and turned out to be very closely connected with Mandela and so on, a brave and fine man, the novelist Barbara Trepido's husband, who became a great friend.
Say the other?
Barbara Trepido was Stanley's wife.
Yeah.
And the second JRF with me was Donald Cruz O'Brien, who worked on Senegal, and particularly on brotherhoods, the Muridic Brotherhood, an Islamic Brotherhood in Senegal. And the 3 of us were thick as thieves. Lots of rugby matches, lots of drinking, lots of subversion, lots of fun.
This is really beginning to work up to the exciting later 60s. This is about 66, isn't it?
This is 67.
67,
yes.
So this is the time of the Troubles.
Absolutely. And as I passed out of that, I had a second year at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies as an assistant lecturer, an old sort of condemned species. They don't exist anymore, I don't think, in British universities. But in the course of that year, I left. I was not in Bloomsbury very much, because I was teaching at the University of Sussex in the African and Asian school there, because of the illness of a man called Bernard Schaffer, So I taught under the chairmanship of Colin Lees, a considerable figure in African political science, and it looked like I was going to become a political scientist. But the teaching frightened me off that, the teaching of political science, which was then very much rooted around things like Talcott Parsons, and I thought unreadable things that bore very little resemblance to reality and certainly were very distant from romance. And some of my mind making up about wanting to be a field working scholar had a lot to do with F.G. Bailey, who was at Sussex at the time, whose trilogy on Orissa remains some of the best reading I've ever done. So the relationship with anthropology really began with an Indianist, a northeastern Indianist. And Freddie was a very, very magnetic figure.
Tell me something more about him.
Well, I mean, he was just a magnificent figure in terms of rants and tirades and so on. He was a very humane figure. I found him very humane, very no nonsense, and had that sort of quality about deflating theory in a way that I suppose recaptured to some extent when I read people like Clifford Geertz. You do get the sense that this is somebody who actually does know what a hut looks like, and what eating rotten food is like, and what sleeping on a camp bed's like. There was an excitement about it, but also a very strong sense out of his work about the absolute central significance of politics, which then became a kind of organising principle in my own work from then on in, and that I really, as a historian, I suppose, if I was any description of what I did, it was about political history more than anything else. That was what I think I understood. And he had an influence on me in that way. He was also very informal, and as an authority figure, he was a giggler and those sorts of things, which mattered quite a lot to me.
Was he a strategizer? He writes a lot about that.
Oh yes, he was a great university politician.
Was he?
He managed to find a suite in Indonesia which was called a BUM, B-U-M, which had wrapping paper said B-U-M on it. He handed them round to anybody he considered to be a bad university man, but he esteemed them.
So, what was their thesis?
My thesis was on the transfer of power in Ghana, and of course was done before the 30-year rule, so I didn't really have access to, in Britain, didn't have access to the Public Record Office, but had access to the most extraordinary run of material in Ghana, including all the cabinet papers in the 1950s, which were just thrilling to be with material that was embargoed to Christmas, in this country, but was on open access in Ghana, and I saw things I shouldn't have seen, I suppose. And I hope I wrote a thesis that was halfway enjoyable, and that then became the sort of text of the very long introduction to the 2-volume study I did of the documentary study I did of the transfer of power in Ghana, which came out in 1990. So it wasn't wasted in that sense. But the Arden Clark papers were of great use because they were an insight into, in Bailey terms, the strategies on either side, that the transfer of power wasn't the story of heroic nationalists on their own. It was a story of heroic nationalists, yes, I'm happy to say that, but also of strategizing imperial diplomats working their way out of empire in a way that was of least damage to their interests. And the interplay of that fascinated me and still fascinates me.
Let's come back to that a bit more in the later part and continue with your career, and then have the ideas parcelled away a bit more later. So you spent 3 years as a junior research?
2 years.
Yeah. Were you, in passing, 1967, because I was at the London School of Economics then and being barred out of the lectures of Keith Hopkins and others.
Yep.
Were you in the Troubles? Were you in Grosvenor Square? Were you?
I wasn't in Grosvenor Square, but I was on all of the marches, and I was by then very left wing, influenced by people like Gareth Stedman Jones. But I was a New Left Review reader and Tariq, and people at SOAS, like Fred Halliday.
You were on the New Left Review?
I wasn't on the editorial board, but I read it avidly, and I knew most of the editorial board. And my politics were there then, very hostile to the Vietnam War. Thought that what was going on in Paris was pretty crazy, but at the same time, broadly sympathetic to all of that. And when I was appointed at SOAS, as I was in 1969, although I was on probation originally, as all new appointees were, visited SOAS students who had been banged up by the police for breaking down doors and so on, and got hauled over the coals by the director of the school for doing
Phillips,
this.
was it?
Yes, who became a friend, actually, interestingly enough, but was very threatened indeed by the student insurrection of 69 to 71, I suppose. So yes, I was not very much involved.
You had to wear ties to go into the dining room.
It was very much like that, yes. A strange mixture
you
of...
knew Stefan quite...
Fortran, yes.
Yes.
Yes. No, it was a strange mixture of sort of officers' mess and high table, but also the civil service. And of course many of the senior common room at SOAS when I joined had distinguished, sometimes quite hidden careers in the Secret Service and were of course recruiters for the Secret Service, and some of them spoke languages that nobody else spoke. And there was a slightly spooky element, very male common room, almost no women at all, and rather military in bearing and in attitude.
Well, maybe as we pass them by, there are a few characters there who I'd love to hear more about. Perhaps we better start with my great mentor and supervisor, Christoph von Führer-Heimendorf. Did you come across Christoph much?
Oh, very much so, yes. And Christoph was a very senior figure at SOAS when I arrived. He went on to be pro-director of the school. He was always very, very distinguished in terms of manners, as you know, very aristocratic in demeanour. It was always charming to be called my dear by him, which was quite a common thing. There was something very lordly about him, but he was a lord, after all. He was always gentlemanly, even when he disagreed with you, as he did very frequently with me and with other young Turks. But it was always done. I never saw him lose his temper. The only time I've ever saw him discomforted was once when he was quite liked looking at pretty girls, which I have great sympathy with. And I saw him once eyeing a very, very beautiful, rather leggy model, I think. There was been a photo shoot in not in Russell Square, the square, but behind, whose name I've now forgotten. But while watching her, he turned his head and walked straight into a parking meter, and it destroyed the composure, it destroyed the dignity. And like a cat that falls down, he then pretended that he'd meant to do it all the time, if you see what I mean.
It's a lovely story.
But one was very, very much aware of the fact that, here was a man who'd been footnoted by Levi-Strauss, who was a very eminent and fine figure. And I didn't really realise until later in my career what an extraordinarily pioneering figure he was in terms of methodology as much as anything else. But I always liked him very much. He was a very, very decent man and a nice person to work with and near, because it was a small common room, so everybody did know everybody else. And they weren't all nice, decent men.
Did you know Betty as well?
Yes.
She was
of power, yes.
A larger-than-life character.
Absolutely so.
Well, the others, what about John Middleton, who was Professor of African History?
John and I know each other, or knew each other very well indeed, not least, of course, because of his wife, who was an Africanist, a very distinguished and very under-recognised Africanist. But John was a lovely colleague, and because he was an East Africanist by research training and so on, he and I sort of complemented one another on lots of ventures in one way or another. We were both very much involved in the early days of something called the Centre for African Studies, which I was chairman of for some time. And he was very active in making that work as an intercollegiate venture. It wasn't just the SOAS thing, it involved LSE, and it involved any other college, including things like the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine in its remit and in its membership. And John was very active in that. And John's internationality was tremendously helpful. That linkage with the International African Institute through John in part, but through other people, was extremely important. But I also, of course, had a relationship with people like Mike Smith at University College, and with Darrell Ford.
M.G. Smith.
Yes.
Yeah. He seems a formidable man.
He was terrifying. It was one's bowels turned to water having to give a paper over at University College. And Darrell was pretty formidable too, in an odd kind of way. And I just remember the back end of Barbara Pym as the departmental secretary, who wrote about them without their knowing it, I think, which was quite funny. But Mike Smith was ferocious and very clever. I liked his work very much. But the other anthropologists at SOAS were almost without exception people I liked very much. It was a prickly relationship between history and anthropology. I was brought up by Roland Oliver, who was my boss, had been my supervisor, but then became my boss. I was basically at the end of 1968. I was offered 3 jobs at once. In those days, that happened, and Africa was beginning to be a burgeoning place of interest. So I was offered a job at Sussex, which was to teach politics, and I'd done that, and I didn't like that very much. And we never moved to Lewis, so we stayed out of the Falmer reach of Sussex. I was also offered a permanent job at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies, but that involved not teaching undergraduates, and I thought that I rather would like to do that. And then the SOAS job in the history department, which was, of course, under then the command of the formidable Bernard Lewis, the great Ottoman historian, who was terrifying and very much like my stepfather in terms of being formidable and terrifying. And that was, in many senses, well, in every sense, it was a very good move, because I stayed there for nearly 40 years in that department. But there was always a pretense of competition between anthropology and history. And I think that the sort of sloganizing that went on was that anthropologists denied history, that the Africanist anthropologists said that Africa had no history, that didn't matter, what mattered is now. And, you know, this continuing myth that they were still unreconstructed structural functionalists. And I think that the anthropologists, conversely, believed that, you know, we were a bunch of people who were only interested in dates and facts and things of that sort, neither of which were true. Were both myths of each other. But there were a lot of very constructive relationships, obviously with people like David Parkin in particular.
Say something about David. He was my Ph.D. examiner.
David was a lovely colleague and a very straightforward and honest and decent man, and sometimes a rather over rigorous man in some ways. I felt very, quite what the word, disappointed in a way by the fact that he increasingly left, it seemed to me, the world that I could understand for a world of linguistics, which he understood, having done language and anthropology as an undergraduate. I found quite a lot of what he was writing about in mid to later career really very difficult to understand, which I felt the loss of in a very, very real sense, and got on better in intellectual terms with Abner Cohen, who of course worked on my side of the continent, as it were, and wrote about things that I did understand. David was, however, an incredibly constructive colleague. I mean, he was a great institution builder, which I think is why he went to Oxford in the end, and those virtues shone out, and a very good team player, no question about it. But I must confess that I ran out of track. He was too clever for me.
Talking of team players, we of course turn to Mary Douglas. How did you get on with Mary? You must have had some overlap with her too.
Oh, I used to go to the seminar with great regularity, and as I went to the seminar run by Lucy Mayer and Ernest Gellner at LSE with great regularity, all of which was pretty unnerving stuff for a young, rather uncertain historian. But I recognised at a very early stage that one of the great things about African history was that it could take in anthropology, that if it didn't understand and bother with anthropology, it was dead in the water. And that in a way, rather unlike history was at that time, or more general history was at that time, this was one of the great challenges and one of the great excitements. The problem with it, of course, was that mastery of another methodology and that the backing up empirical literature around that methodology was immensely time-consuming. And that was true throughout my career, of realizing that there were things in more general history that needed to be applied in Africa, which then had to have work done on them. The examples being things like population history, family history, things that still interest me very greatly, were things that, because they had no literature in Africa and consequently no evident methodology, one had to think about a lot, but think about them through things like the Industrial Revolution, or family formation in 19th century Provence and so on, all of which was enormous fun and convinced me of one of the skeins in my conviction career, was that African history is history, and that it's just a bit of history that isn't European history, and European history is just a bit of history that isn't African history. They're all history, and they require respect for one another. That was what was very much lacking at the beginning of my career in African history. One of the thrills of African history in the early 1960s was that it was condemned. Roland Oliver had this tremendous struggle to get any African history papers onto the history board's examination board, because there were plenty of members of the history board of the University of London who said that Africa had no history. History was about documents, and there weren't very many documents in Africa that weren't written by white people, and the ones that were written by white people were imperial history, and we already had imperial historians. And establishing the fact that there were other ways of coming at history through things like archaeology and anthropology and so on was a very real struggle, and particularly when it came to establishing a special subject.
Let's continue on the possibility of an African history. Just a sort of question that occurred to me in the interval, which was John Barnes once wrote a famous article called African Models in the New Guinea Highlands. I was wondering whether part of the problem was European history models in the African savannas. In other words, was it difficult to take models developed in European history and make use of them in your African history?
I think the problem was actually that people did that all the damn time, and they did it very ineptly. I took my own models, obviously, from things I knew about, but they tended to be out of the almost sort of magical realist world of the classical Aegean. And to a certain extent I would continue to justify that. I don't think it's completely an aberration when one actually does look at the history of the Peloponnese in the pre-Homeric period and so on. There is a way in which you could actually quite usefully use Africa to think about some of the problems of scale and so on there. But that's a side issue. The problem was, I think, the necessity that people felt to find African history slight in comparison with European history, because of not merely the absence of documentation, a pre-literate continent, how can it leave a historical record, and B, of course, an absence of ruins. It's not just documents. It's also that it doesn't have colossuses, and it doesn't have Tirinses and so on. It was built of mud, and it fell down for the most part, with the exception of things like Great Zimbabwe. So there is that absence of a tactile past that condemns it. But the very demanding quality, I think, of what had become Western history by the 1960s meant that Africa did look threadbare. And I don't know how often I've had to answer the question when people said, "What do you do?" And you said that you were an African historian. Oh, do they have any?
Oxymoron.
Yes, exactly. Military intelligence had that kind of quality about it. And what was so thrilling about African history was exactly that it could only be built by a kind of bricolage of a variety of disciplines. Some of the disciplines were well beyond me, like linguistic chronology, for example, much of which does turn out now to have been a waste of time anyhow. But a lot of the archaeology is incredibly technical and increasingly, of course, statistical and difficult. But the rest of the stuff really was very exciting, and that necessarily was derived from some kinds of European models. Some of the European models are really pernicious, though, and one of the famous examples is the invention of Asante bureaucracy by Ivor Wilkes. And this is based on some notion that Weber didn't really mean that bureaucracy was about offices and desks. It was about routines and institutions, and that the Asante had a bureaucracy, which, given that the Asante was some of the most violent opposers of written education, and predecessors of Boko Haram, if you like, against missions, precisely for those sorts of reasons, is somewhat ironic. But also the periodization of African history, which we insisted on talking about the African Middle Ages, and so on, as though this was having kind of meaning at all in terms of Africans' own understanding of the past, I think was always invited criticism of the sort that it's not really like European history, it's not real history. And I think from the beginning we ought to have been a little bit more self-assured about what it was that we had, and to have been a little bit more honest about what it was that we didn't have. And I think that one of the damaging things at the beginning of my experience as a student was that the claim that somehow oral tradition was exactly the same as written documents. And oral sources aren't the same as written documents. They're very different sorts of being in many respects, and we under discussed that. It was left to basically an anthropologist who became a historian in Jan van Sina to sort of really think through some of that, and not all of that's immediately satisfactory, but nonetheless it's much more thoughtful than the way that some historians were using oral sources and oral tradition in particular as though they were an archive, and clearly they aren't. But a lot of that's very challenging and exciting. You're left with all sorts of considerations about what is it that Africans think history is, and which is an intriguing question.
Well, I know you wanted to sort of lay down some thoughts on African history, and I don't want to not ask the questions which will bring those out. So, is it really to assert that it's much more important than many historians or academics elsewhere realise the continuing tradition of African history, or that it is different, or what is really important about it?
Well, the important thing about it is that it is the motherland of us all, I suppose, at the end of the day, which is a rather poor kind of blackmailing kind of assertion that we ought to know about this, because it's where we all come from. But the secondly, it's a continent, and it's a continent that has a history. To pretend that it doesn't have a history is of course, a function of ignorance, and consequently it's a history that is worth recapturing. It has moments of great significance and importance for us in terms of a whole range of experiential things which could be of assistance and are of assistance in understanding the pasts of not just Africans but people everywhere. But the general sense that one has of an entire continent and the peoples of an entire continent who have been denied a history by the functions of 18th, 19th century science, by imperialism, by the obduracy, I think, of intellectual arrogance, is something that did need redressing. And it should be now being redressed by Africans themselves. And unfortunately, because of the sort of political economy of education in Africa, it tends not to be being done. I still think that the history of an entire continent is something that historians must be aware of and thoughtful about. Not least because there are things that happened or have appeared to have happened in Africa, which are very thought-provoking when it comes to other parts of the world. I think that I suspect that it's the case that I was more sensitized to the importance of things like the history of the family, which strikes me as one of the great advances made in historiography in general, in the late 20th century had something to do with the fact that we recognised that Africa was a fascinating laboratory in the sense of just about every kind of format that one could think of in terms of kinship and family. That they come in multiple forms over time, that they are very challenging. As importantly, that the people who live in these lived worlds have a very high degree of self-awareness about this. These are things that are very high on their lists of things that are important. So I justify those sorts of things in a big way. But there are other things that excited me at the time and of conversion. It's recognition that Africa had a population rate, increase rate that was higher than anything ever recorded anywhere else, ever. And it had exceeded any of the Latin American examples, in cases of 5% per annum, which is huge. And the implications of that for, in quotes, world order, which I don't think is a completely played out set of issues, but why that should be so. And I've, in later life, become more and more intrigued by and completely unsatisfied by the answers to it. But what seems to be pretty evident, the profound spirituality of much of Africa. And it's a generalization that I don't like generalizations about Africa, which is a continent and not a country or a single culture. But nonetheless, the absolute significance of forms of spiritual expression, religion, whatever one wants to discuss it, in Africa does seem to be much more significant than almost anywhere else I can think of in the world. And it's not a recapturing of the deep past, it is something that is African, in a very profound sense, not least because it is so very evident in the very, very large African diaspora too. And I'm intrigued by why that should be so. I don't know any answers to that.
Well, that gives a lot of threads. One is going back to population. I mean, perhaps the most interesting demographer of the 80s was J.C. Caldwell, Jack Caldwell, and his theory of Ghanaian population, that it was to do with resource flows, whether they were downwards or upwards. And I was wondering, I mean, you know his work, I was wondering whether you can reverse I think it was in Nigeria that he worked in, and the problem was that people got more out of their children than they gave, but certainly, you know, they needed them or they wanted them because they got a lot out of them in later life and sickness and so on. Is that changing in Africa? In other words, it's still got very high fertility rates, sub-Saharan Africa. Is it likely to change?
I'm not at all sure what we would base that on. I think that the data is very suspect, and they've become more suspect since the material that Caldwell worked on dates, and that a lot of that was colonially collected. The colonial censuses, by and large, were reasonably accurate. I think many post-colonial censuses have been so politicized we really don't know. The amount of course, leaving of Africa has been much more extensive than has been recorded, because much of it's illegal and uncharted. So I think those things are very difficult to know. I think basically you're right that the increase in population continues unchanged, but quite what the sources of it are, whether the sources of it are but push out of the countryside into towns, and of course Africa is now the mother to the most extensive magnum huge towns in the world, rapidly growing ones. I really don't know the answer to that. I'm insufficiently tooled up to answer that.
Well, turning to the other sort of related the aspect of family history, and you said that you mentioned previously that you'd known the work of Peter Laslett and the Cambridge Group and so on. How did that influence you?
It influenced me and a co-worker who I did a lot of work with and who I respect very greatly, Shula Marks, who is probably the most distinguished historian I worked with, the great revisionist Southern African historian. And she and I worked closely together, partly as co-runners of a revisionist history seminar, an anti-liberal history seminar, which I think was in very large measure a launch pad for the new, rather more robust Southern African historiography that now dominates the stage. Most of the people who are active in that world performed there first. But she and I talked a lot about the impact of the histories of other parts of the world, and we were very taken by Laslett and Co., but also, of course, Jack Goody's own thinking about how all of that worked out, and tried to create some sort of interest in the history of the family in Africa. Staged a conference which was very successful. Large numbers of people came.
Christina Opon.
That's right. We had a special number of the Journal of African History, which Shula and I wrote the introduction to, and we're expecting lots and lots of people to climb aboard the boat and sail off into a future where people did look seriously at the history of the family, and no such thing has occurred. And basically, I think both of us regard that as a sunken ship, and rather a tragedy, not least because it's something that in my own field work I've been very much aware of, the absolute significance of the history of families, if not the history of the family. It's something that echoes around just about every interview I've ever had in the last 20 years.
Why is it sunk?
I've no idea. I suppose because of the fact that it is microcosmic, and the fact that quite a lot of the younger historians or successor historians have tended to work on bigger subjects. There's been a big seismic shift in Africa away from what allured me in the beginning was the fact that it was a history of a continent from dot to date, and that's the way that it worked. The number of people doing pre-colonial history now is minuscule, dwarfed enormously by late 20th and early 21st century historians who work on approximately important things, like famine, like health, like AIDS, like those sorts of issues. And that's terribly good. But there's very little pre-colonial history. And one of the great weaknesses of African history has been the fact that it's never focused in on the absolute significance of doing your work in the vernacular. And of course, very few historians of Africa actually speak the languages of the places they work on, unlike Italian historians or French historians or whatever. And I think that is a difference. The argument being, of course, that the language groups are so small that you're wasting your time learning those languages. But I think that's a very big difference between history and anthropology in this respect. Not all historians are linguistic ignoramuses, but it's more true than not. And consequently, there's a way in which the historiography has followed the languages, so that where you get a big language and a big archive, you'll get more history written. Where you get there's very little work for well, I suppose it's difficult to work there, but very much less work on Portuguese Africa than there should be, for example. And that's a great pity, Portuguese-speaking Africa than there should be.
You mentioned Jack Goody in passing. I mean, you must know him quite well because he worked in Ghana. Has he influenced you, his work, in any way particularly?
Enormously. I've used his work as a teacher endlessly, been stimulated more by Jack Goody's work, I think, than any other scholar working on Africa, both his work on literacy and illiteracy to begin with, and then his work on technology, tradition and the state, which seemed to me the most important thing written about sequence and comparison since, I don't know, Engels, maybe. I mean, it's got that kind of profundity to it. It's a very, very serious piece of work. And the thoughtfulness of everything he's ever done has always had a tremendous impact on me. His early ethnography is obviously very good and exciting, but it tends to be on parts of Ghana that I'm not terribly interested in. But I mean, in comparison with people who worked on those sorts of areas like Rattray and so on, it's really impeccable. But he's always brimming over with ideas, and has gone on brimming over with ideas forever, it seems. And is a great facilitator and exciter of others, which is, I think, one of his great merits. He's been of great importance to me and to students, I'm glad to say, who enjoyed his work.
I often say, if you were cast on a desert island to the person I'm interviewing, and you had to take a couple of your own books and justify to the person who was allowing you to take the books why you take them. In other words, what would you like to be remembered for in terms of your writing and your theories?
The book that I like most of, that I wrote, and that I enjoyed writing most, is a book called Murder and Politics in Colonial Ghana.
Say it more loudly.
Murder and Politics in Colonial Ghana,
which
is ostensibly a sort of detective story about a murder that may or may not have been a ritual murder in 1944 of a sub-chief in the funeral ceremonies of a dead king. And it seemed to me it was a good story to begin with, and there was a lot of material on it that I unearthed in the archives. What was more important was that lots and lots of Ghanaians said this is a very important story. You cannot possibly understand the motives of nationalism without thinking about this. This really matters. So I went away and worked on it and saw that it was a kind of peg to look at two things that seemed to me had been neglected in the nationalist literature. The first was the significance of the countryside, and there was far too little written historically on what nationalism and what radicalism looked like in the countryside, what it actually meant in the countryside, what the passing of Ancien Régime actually looked like in the countryside. And that was one set of clothes to hang on the peg. And the other thing to hang on the peg was the whole issue of traditional rule, which to some extent I think the nationalist literature had seen, as I say, as Ancien Régime, and consequently doomed, as a kind of doomed dyad with colonial rule itself, and that it would die. And it manifestly had not died. And what was exciting again about being in Ghana was, in fact, every day in the newspapers, and there are lots and lots and lots of them, there were stories about chieftaincy. So this is very much not a dead institution. It's an institution that people were still fascinated by, unless editors got it badly wrong. So it was really a book about modernity in a way, and there were some very haunting images. That the mausoleum in which the dead body was contained, in which I spent a lot of time working physically in the area around it, was a mausoleum in 1944 that was crossed by the first telegraph line in that part of West Africa, and about 2 miles away from the railway line. And I loved the juxtaposition of somewhere where these sorts of things were going on together and next to one another. Similarly, the ceremony at which the ritual murder might or might not have occurred, I think it did occur, was one that took place within literally listening distance of a Presbyterian church service in honour of the dead man. And I like those combinations of things. So it was a book about royalty and about the death of royalty, about the nature of village politics and state politics up country, which had very little to do with trade unions and the sorts of things that I'd worked on before. And that led on to the second book, which in a sense was a follow-up, which was a broader discussion of the relationship between nationalism and chieftaincy, which I hope recast the nationalist movement in Ghana in terms of suggesting that part of what it was about was the destruction of rural ascribed hegemony. It was about destroying chieftaincy, which I hope I showed happened. That's what it did progressively between the Nationalist Party's first success in 1951 and its being booted out of office in 1966. That in those 15 years it effectively destroyed an institution that still had resources, still had institutional ability, still had methods, and still had a good deal of support, but was crushed by upper and nether millstones of one sort or another. And I found that an intriguing story, which I continue to find intriguing. What's very, very weird for me is that having tried to recast African history or bits of African history away from this urban focus to a more rural focus, in a bizarre kind of way, the new Africa is sporting more and more chieftaincy. Chieftaincy has been reinvigorated in the new democratic states of Africa in a big way, including amazingly South Africa, where chieftaincy is being respected and put in place in constitutional terms as responsible, respectable voices of an authentic, non-European derived kind of governance. And it's being respected by NGOs and by government bodies outside Africa as the channels through which you can push aid and pressure and so on. So the revival of chieftaincy is fascinating for me, particularly. It's not dead, as I try to argue. But I'm also interested in the things that chieftaincy, the ways in which chieftaincy isn't just political, and that's something that I wish I had had more time to do and had more physical ability to do more field work, because I remain very interested in the spiritual necessity as seen by participants of chieftaincy in terms of the maintenance of a kind of spiritual order and the order of ancestry and so on. And that goes back to the family history issue, that families aren't just people who are alive, they're also people who are dead. And that was always very apparent to me in interview terms. And that then had a bearing on space and how space was seen and sort of Mark Bloch stuff.
Well, just one question following from that. Looking at the world now, it's clear that the Western democratic political systems are not going to be suitable to be transported wholesale to other parts of the world, particularly China and India, and probably not to Africa either. And therefore, do you think chieftainship might be a kind of African contribution to an alternative forms of political order?
Yes, as long as one recognises that what chieftaincy is today isn't what chieftaincy was yesterday.
Yes, reinvented tradition.
Well, in large measure, but I'm very struck by a wonderful video that I have of a very important first fruits ceremony in Ghana, which took place in 1993 rather, of a very important Asante first fruits festival, in which the chiefs on parade on this great day of glitter and bling and gold everywhere and tasselled umbrellas and so on. I know most of them, and the vast majority of them are cardiac surgeons and accountants and so on. So there's this way in which chiefs are very different kinds of figures. They're people of a different kind of modern respectability. And what dignified, when I was working in the kingdom I worked in for some time, I was always struck by how they dressed like chiefs looked in pictures we know from the early 19th century, in kente cloth, which is very much like a toga, very, very beautiful with gold thread in it and so on. But almost invariably they had Ray-Ban sunglasses and Rolex watches, which sort of gave the game away. And I love those juxtapositions. It's quite sort of Jack Goodyish actually to enjoy those sorts of things.
And now you're living in Wales, and well, part of the time anyway, and no doubt, like all academics, you can't stop researching, writing, reading, and so on. So, what are you interested in at the moment? Well,
the last thing was an attempt to put some of what I thought it was all about together with a young colleague of mine who used to be my student, John Parker, which was in the Oxford University Press series of very short introductions, which was the very short introduction to African history. Since that time, I've been thinking about something that I think is probably quite close to your interest, which is biography, and that very much an attempt to think about what African biography might look like, stimulated in part by thinking through what I didn't like about your colleague at Cambridge, John Iliff's Life of Obasanjo, which I reviewed for the Contemporary Review, which is a wonderful, beautiful, dutifully scholarly life, which is lifeless in my submission anyhow. And I wondered what it was about what I wanted out of a biography, what I expected out of a biography that seems so very difficult to squeeze out of African stones, and whether it is that we have very different ideas about life, in a sense, and what a life should look like, or how you can reclaim a life in literary terms from the ways in which Africans see lives, but also recognition that those lives are different, that relationships with parents, which are so central to our own understandings of biography, that the sort of Freudianized variants of biography are not very African ways of looking at childhood, for example. The whole issue of childhood begins to interest me more and more, thinking through some of, in fact, Jack Goody's wife's work on fostering and so on, which is very exciting in those terms. So that's sort of...
Former wife. Esther Goody.
Esther Goody. Some of those things are exercising me at the moment, and I think I'm working up to something on that.
Excellent. Well, unless there's something else, that the one thing we haven't really talked about is music. I mean, you said at school you didn't really learn an instrument, but I know now music is very important for you. Has it been important through your life?
It's always been important as a listener, but never as a doer. And my wife got very fed up with me saying, "Gosh, I wish I could make that noise," and fobbed me off or got rid of me once with the present of five singing lessons with a singing teacher. And I went away to find out whether I could sing, and discovered that I could, and learnt to read music and did little children's exams, and got up to grade 6 originally. And these grade exams being, of course, by about 50 years older than anybody else waiting to do the exam. And I now do quite a lot of choral singing, and enjoy that enormously. I'm also chairman of the Mid Wales Chamber Orchestra, which is a professional orchestra in Mid Wales. So I listen to a lot of music and have a lot to do with musicians. And I find it very, very fulfilling and an important part of my life.
And centering on the Baroque?
That's but because I sing a lot, yes, mainly Baroque, but I also love lots of things like Fauré and Britten and Poulenc and so on as well. I mean,
do you find music, I often ask whether, and a few people do, find music inspires their work? And for example, Maitland, the historian, used to listen to music when he was writing sometimes. You're supposed to be able to detect what he was listening to by length of his sentences. Do you listen to music in relation to your work at all?
Yes, I think I do, but I mean, usually actually to pacify myself and to calm myself down. I get very cross with people, and it's a good way of uncrossing. It's a good way of getting rid of anger in many ways. But I think I'm also excited. I see things when I hear music, and quite a lot of the things I see are African as well as things that are physically closer to home. And I sometimes, somebody said to me the other day that there was a Shostakovich quintet that was the soundtrack to the Holocaust, and I was very taken by that as an image. And there are things that I listen to that are soundtracks to things that I've seen or have worked on and have excited me, which are important. And I think I have a rather filmic sense of the past, which is probably quite negative, a bad thing to have.
Do you like writing?
Yes, very much.
How do you write?
I write on the computer now, completely. And I suppose because it comes as an utter relief from the past. And I was recalling to a young colleague the other day about, I typed up my own thesis, of course in 3 copies, with onion skin copy paper in between. And of course every error had to be rubbed out with an eraser, right the way through, however many hundreds of pages it was, and the sheer agony of that. The idea of being able to do that with a keystroke is just like heaven. And I do like being able to work over and work over and work over things that I write. I care about style, and I hope that I write with a little bit of style. Because one of the things I would say about African history in general is it has tended to be a bit stodgy. And I can't look back at much of what I've read as an Africanist by other Africanists that have made me feel carried away by the prose. There are 1 or 2 exceptions, but not many. It's tended to be rather a stodgy field. Partly because it's a very defensive field. It's always covering its back against accusations that it's being patronising or racist or whatever, which is a pity.
That's about all I have. But is there anything that you would have really liked me to ask you, or, as they say to the people going over the trench, is there any questions, or is there anything I've missed?
I don't think there really is, other than, I suppose, of course, of Saraband. That it's the sense that one has that this great struggle that I saw my predecessors, people like Roland Oliver, people like Philip Curtin, the attempt to validate African history to a world of historians who didn't really believe that there was any, is now something that is being lost again, and it's being, of course, lost again because of the underfunding of institutions which would say that the history of Africa is of less importance than a number of other trendy things that one can get bottoms on seats in universities for. And I think there are probably fewer historians of Africa in higher education in Britain anyhow now than there were 20 years ago, which I find a very depressing thought in many ways.
They'll come back when Africa is leading the world.
Inshallah.
Inshallah. Thank you very much.